March 14th, 1945. The Siegfried Line, Western Germany. Second Lieutenant Thomas Waldron pressed his field glasses against his eyes and watched smoke rise from a German position 12 miles away. He could not see the enemy. He had never seen this particular enemy. The hilltop bunker complex existed only as coordinates on his map, numbers radioed from reconnaissance aircraft, and intelligence reports describing reinforced concrete structures protecting German artillery. Waldron lifted his radio handset. Fire mission, grid 627 to 419. Enemy artillery position. Request battalion fire. Request long-tom support if available. 3 miles behind him, invisible beyond the rolling terrain of Western Germany, crews of the 458th Field Artillery Battalion received the coordinates. Inside the Fire Direction Center, a converted farmhouse basement lit by kerosene lamps and candlelight. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Staff sergeants moved with practiced precision. Plotting boards showed every friendly battery position. Firing tables opened to pages marked with pencil calculations. Within 90 seconds, 3 separate artillery batteries, thousands of yards apart from each other, began computing independent firing solutions that would synchronize their shells to arrive at the same instant. 15 miles to the rear, near a village whose name American gunners would never learn how to pronounce, crews of the 733rd Field Artillery Battalion loaded a 127-pound high-explosive shell into their M1A1 Long Tom. The gun's barrel extended 23 feet from breech to muzzle. The weapon weighed nearly 14 tons. Moving it required tractors and 16-man crews working in choreographed sequence to emplace the firing platform, level the trails, and ram home ammunition that individual soldiers could barely lift. The Fire Direction Center transmitted elevation and azimuth. The gun captain repeated the numbers back. Gunner number 3 spun the elevation wheel. Gunner number 1 traversed left, counting clicks. The Long Tom's barrel rose to precisely 41 degrees above horizontal, pointing at empty sky, aimed at coordinates the gun crew would never see. Range 1, 3, 400, charge 8, time of flight 98 seconds. At exactly 14:27 hours, 3 separate artillery battalions fired in sequence. The Long Tom fired first, its massive barrel recoiling 4 feet backward against hydraulic buffers designed to absorb 20,000 pounds of force. 3 seconds later, a battery of M1 155mm howitzers 9 miles forward fired their rounds. 5 seconds after that, division artillery firing M2 A1 105mm howitzers added their weight. Shells arced through the March sky along ballistic curves calculated by men with slide rules and graphical firing tables. The Long Tom's projectile climbed to nearly 20,000 feet before beginning its descent. The physics were elegant and unforgiving. Gravity pulled at 9.8 meters per second squared. Wind deflection calculations accounted for crosswinds at multiple altitudes. Temperature corrections adjusted for powder burn rates in cold weather. Barrel wear factors modified muzzle velocity predictions. 98 seconds after the Long Tom fired, Lieutenant Waldron heard nothing. Then, the hilltop 12 miles distant erupted. The Long Tom's shell arrived first, its impact invisible beneath the subsequent explosions of 24 additional shells from multiple batteries arriving within a 3-second window. The German position disappeared beneath a curtain of smoke and debris. Concrete that had resisted months of bombing fragmented under the combined impact of shells that together delivered more than 3,000 pounds of high explosive. Waldron adjusted his field glasses. Effect on target. Mission complete. The German artillery battery ceased firing, its crews either dead or scattered. The concrete bunkers cracked open like eggshells struck by hammers. American infantry advancing 3 miles to the east never knew that German guns had been preparing to target their assembly areas. They never saw the enemy gunners who had ranged their positions. The threat was eliminated by artillery crews who could not see their target, firing at coordinates transmitted by observers they had never met. Following calculations performed by staff sergeants with high school educations and 3 months of specialized training, this was how artillery killed in 1945. invisibly, mathematically, with a precision that would have seemed impossible to gunners of earlier generations who had aimed their cannon by eye and fired over open sights at enemies they could watch through drifting powder smoke. The evolution from direct fire to indirect fire represented one of the most profound transformations in military history. It was a revolution not of a single invention, but of integrated systems, mathematical techniques, organizational structures, and battlefield communications that together redefined what artillery could accomplish. By 1945, American artillery could mass fire from dozens of battalions on a single target within minutes, coordinate time-on-target strikes that brought shells from different distances simultaneously onto the same point, and engage enemy positions on reverse slopes, in defiles, behind hills, anywhere within a 20-mile radius that a forward observer could identify with map coordinates. The German military never achieved this level of coordination. Neither did the Japanese. Even the British, whose artillery proved highly effective throughout the war, lacked the systematic approach that American gunners had perfected. The United States entered World War II with artillery doctrine, equipment, and training methods that would prove decisive in every theater where American forces fought. The story of how this capability developed begins not with technological brilliance, but with mathematical problems that had plagued artillery since gunpowder weapons first appeared on European battlefields. October 7, 1812. The village of Borodino, 70 miles west of Moscow. French artillery batteries deployed in line-ahead formation, their bronze 12-pounder cannon positioned wheel-to-wheel across open fields within 1,000 yards of Russian defensive positions. Gun crews could see their targets clearly. Russian infantry in white summer uniforms stood in formation behind earthwork redoubts. Russian artillery returned fire from positions equally visible to French gunners. This was direct fire. The gun captain sighted down the barrel, adjusting elevation by eye, watching where his round shot struck, making corrections for the next shot. Smoke obscured the battlefield after the first volley. Subsequent shots were fired into white clouds with only occasional glimpses of the target. Accuracy depended entirely on the skill and judgment of individual gun captains, who aimed their pieces like oversized rifles. The technique had not changed fundamentally in 300 years. Cannon fired at targets they could see, from positions exposed to enemy observation and counterfire. Effective range was limited by the distance at which human eyes could identify targets through black powder smoke. At Borodino, French artillery fired approximately 60,000 rounds during a single day of battle. Most shells struck empty ground. Some hit their intended targets. Many wounded or killed French infantry advancing through the beaten zone. The limitations of direct fire became more severe as infantry weapons improved. By 1870, with the introduction of breech-loading rifles firing metallic cartridges, infantry could kill exposed gunners at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. Artillery positioned within direct line of sight of enemy infantry became vulnerable to aimed rifle fire that could eliminate gun crews before they could effectively engage their targets. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871 demonstrated the problem with brutal clarity. Prussian infantry armed with dressé needle guns systematically destroyed French artillery batteries that attempted to deploy in traditional direct fire positions. At the Battle of Sedan on September 1, 1870, French gunners suffered such severe casualties from Prussian rifle fire that entire batteries were silenced without firing effective return fire. Military theorists recognized the tactical dilemma. Artillery needed to be positioned close enough to support infantry, but far enough back to avoid rifle fire. The solution required firing at targets the gunners could not see, from positions concealed from enemy observation. This meant abandoning the direct line of sight between gun and target that had defined artillery employment since cannon were invented. The mathematics of indirect fire had existed in theoretical form since the 16th century. Niccolò Tartaglia, an Italian mathematician, published Nova Scientia in 1537, documenting the parabolic trajectory of projectiles and providing tables for calculating range based on elevation angle. For 3 centuries, his work remained largely theoretical. Gun captains found it easier to sight by eye than to calculate angles and consult firing tables. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In 1882, Russian Lieutenant Colonel K.G. Guk published Field Artillery Fire from Covered Positions, describing a geometric method for indirect laying. Instead of aiming the gun at the target, gunners aimed at reference points offset from the target at known angles. The gun would be oriented to the reference point, then traversed by the calculated angle to point at the unseen target. Elevation would be set using firing tables that predicted the trajectory needed to reach a specific range. Guk's method worked in theory. Practical implementation required several additional developments. First, accurate surveying to establish the exact positions of guns and targets on a common coordinate system. Second, reliable communications between observers who could see the target and gunners who could not. Third, standardized procedures for transmitting firing data and making corrections. Fourth, accurate firing tables that accounted for variables affecting projectile flight. The Boer War of 1899 to 1902 forced these developments into practical application. British artillery advancing across the open veldt of South Africa encountered Boer riflemen armed with modern Mauser rifles, firing smokeless powder ammunition. Boer marksmen, concealed in kopjes and behind rocks, systematically eliminated British gun crews attempting to deploy in traditional direct fire positions. Major Ernest Swinton, serving with British forces in South Africa, documented artillery casualties. At Colenso on December 15, 1899, 2 British field batteries attempted to advance within direct fire range of Boer positions. Within minutes, Boer rifles killed or wounded most of the gunners and draft animals. The surviving British troops were forced to abandon 12 field guns. British artillery officers learned to deploy guns in covered positions, using forward observers to spot targets and adjust fire. The technique was crude initially. Observers signaled corrections using flags or by sending runners. Accuracy was poor. But British gunners who adopted indirect fire methods survived. Those who continued using traditional direct fire tactics suffered unsustainable casualties. By 1914, when the First World War began, most European armies had adopted indirect fire as standard doctrine. The technology supporting indirect fire had also matured. Panoramic sights allowed precise gun laying by instrument rather than by eye. Improved surveying equipment let artillery units establish accurate battery positions. Field telephones provided reliable communications between forward observers and gun positions. Standardized firing procedures enabled coordinated fire from multiple batteries. The First World War transformed indirect fire from an interesting technique into the dominant employment method for field artillery. Trench warfare made direct fire nearly impossible. Opposing forces occupied fortified positions, separated by a devastated no-man's land. Artillery on both sides fired from positions miles behind the front lines at targets they could not see, guided by forward observers in the trenches or aerial observers in primitive aircraft. The scale of artillery fire in World War I exceeded anything previously seen in warfare. At the Battle of Verdun, February to December 1916, French and German artillery together fired approximately 40 million shells. At Passchendaele in 1917, British artillery fired over 4 million shells in a preliminary bombardment lasting 19 days before the infantry assault. Indirect fire enabled this massive expenditure of ammunition. Guns positioned miles behind the front lines could fire continuously without being suppressed by enemy return fire. Forward observers, connected to gun positions by telephone lines, could call for fire on enemy positions, adjust fall of shot, and mass fires from multiple batteries on critical targets. The old limitations of direct fire, range limited by line of sight and vulnerability to enemy observation, had been overcome. The United States Army entered World War I with minimal understanding of modern artillery employment. American field artillery in 1917 still used equipment and techniques that European armies had abandoned a decade earlier. The standard American field piece was the 3-inch gun M1000, 902, with a maximum range of approximately 7,000 yards. American artillery doctrine still emphasized direct fire at visible targets. The American Expeditionary Force arriving in France in 1917 had to learn indirect fire techniques from their French and British allies. American artillery officers attended Allied artillery schools. American batteries were equipped with French 75mm guns and 155mm howitzers. American gunners adopted French firing procedures, French survey methods, French communications protocols. The learning curve was steep and paid in blood. American artillery supporting the 1st Division at Cantigny in May 1918 struggled with basic fire mission procedures. Forward observers could not effectively communicate target locations. Fire direction centers made errors in calculating firing data. Rounds fell short, endangering American infantry. Other rounds fell long, wasting ammunition on empty ground. By the Meuse-Argonne offensive in September 1918, American artillery had improved dramatically. The attack began with a coordinated barrage from 2,700 American and French guns, firing along a 20-mile front. American fire direction centers could mass fires from multiple battalions. American forward observers had mastered adjustment procedures. American survey sections had accurately established battery positions on a common coordinate grid. The final days of World War I saw American artillery achieving effects that would have been impossible with direct fire methods. On November 9, 1918, 2 days before the armistice, American artillery of First Army caught a German division attempting to withdraw across open ground near Stenay. Multiple artillery battalions engaged the German column with coordinated fire adjusted by multiple forward observers. In less than 2 hours, American artillery killed or wounded over 2,000 German soldiers, destroyed dozens of vehicles, and shattered the German units. Cohesion without a single American artillery piece being visible to the enemy. This was the promise of indirect fire fully realized. Artillery had become a weapon system capable of massing devastating firepower on targets far beyond visual range, directed by observers communicating electronically, firing with mathematical precision from concealed positions that enemy forces could not locate or suppress. But the system had severe limitations that became apparent to anyone who thought carefully about what had been achieved. August 15, 1919. Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Brigadier General William Westervelt convened the board that would bear his name to assess American artillery performance in World War I and recommend improvements. The Westervelt board included senior artillery officers, ordnance specialists, and technical experts. Over 6 months of hearings, they interviewed hundreds of artillery officers who had served in France, examined equipment and tactics used by all combatant powers, and analyzed after-action reports from every major American artillery operation of the war. The board's findings were sobering. American artillery had proven adequate by 1918, but only after adopting equipment, techniques, and procedures developed by European armies. The United States had entered the war woefully unprepared. American artillery doctrine was obsolete. American equipment was insufficient for modern warfare. American training methods did not prepare units for the complexities of indirect fire. More concerning were fundamental problems that affected all armies, not just the United States. Indirect fire in World War I had been slow, cumbersome, and wasteful of ammunition. Forward observers took minutes to transmit target locations. Fire direction centers took additional minutes to calculate firing data. Initial rounds frequently missed by hundreds of yards, requiring extensive adjustment before effective fire could be delivered. Massing fires from multiple batteries required complex coordination that often failed under combat conditions. The board identified the core problem. Fire direction in World War I was decentralized to individual batteries. Each battery operated semi-independently, with its own forward observer, its own fire direction calculations, its own communication channels. Massing fires from multiple batteries required coordinating independent entities that might be using slightly different survey data, slightly different firing procedures, and whose forward observers might not even be looking at the same target. Captain Carlos Brewer, testifying before the board, proposed a revolutionary solution. Centralize fire direction at battalion level. Instead of each battery computing its own firing data, create a battalion fire direction center that would compute firing solutions for all batteries in the battalion simultaneously. This would ensure common survey data, standardized procedures, and unified command of all battalion fires. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Multiple batteries could be brought to bear on a single target as easily as a single battery, simply by transmitting firing data to all guns simultaneously. The board endorsed Brewer's proposal and recommended its immediate implementation, but the United States Army of 1919 had other priorities. Defense budgets collapsed after the armistice, artillery units were demobilized, equipment was placed in storage. The innovations that might have revolutionized American artillery remained theoretical proposals in War Department files. Brewer, promoted to lieutenant colonel, was assigned to the Field Artillery School at Fort Sill in 1929. He was appointed director of the Gunnery Department with a mandate to modernize American artillery doctrine. Brewer gathered a team of instructors who shared his vision: Major Herbert Chorney, Captain George Rulon, Captain Harold Bull. Together, they began developing the systems that would define American artillery in World War II. The Fire Direction Center, as Brewer conceived it, was an organizational and procedural innovation rather than a technological one. The FDC would receive fire missions from forward observers, determine which batteries should engage the target, compute firing data for each battery, transmit fire commands, and coordinate timing so that fires from multiple batteries could be synchronized. The FDC would maintain a master firing chart showing all friendly battery positions, known enemy positions, no fire zones, and registration points. Registration was crucial to making the system work. Before engaging actual targets, batteries would fire at surveyed registration points, where fall of shot could be accurately observed. Corrections determined during registration, accounting for weather, ammunition variations, and individual gun characteristics, would be applied to all subsequent fire missions. This meant the first round fired at an unknown target would be far more accurate than the first round in the World War I system, where every new target required extensive adjustment. Brewer and his instructors tested the Fire Direction Center concept in field exercises through the early 1930s. Initial trials were disappointing. Radio communications proved unreliable. Forward observers struggled to transmit standardized fire missions. Battery commanders resented losing direct control of their guns to a centralized headquarters. Fire direction officers made calculation errors under pressure. The breakthrough came in 1933 with the development of the Graphical Firing Table, or GFT. Previous firing tables had been numerical, requiring gunners to look up range in one column, find elevation in another, then interpolate between values. The GFT represented the same data graphically, allowing fire direction officers to read firing data directly from a rotating circular slide rule. A competent FDC operator could compute a fire mission in under 30 seconds using the GFT, compared to several minutes with numerical tables. The GFT, combined with standardized fire mission procedures and improved radio equipment, made the Battalion Fire Direction Center practical. In 1934, the Field Artillery School conducted the first successful demonstration of battalion-level fire direction. 6 batteries, emplaced at different locations around Fort Sill, engaged multiple targets in rapid succession using fire commands transmitted from a single FDC. Observers reported that fires from all 6 batteries arrived on target within seconds of each other, far faster than the old system of individual battery fire direction. By 1938, battalion fire direction had become standard doctrine for American field artillery. Every artillery officer graduating from Fort Sill was trained in FDC operations. Field manuals documented standardized procedures. Training exercises emphasized speed and accuracy in fire direction. The American artillery community had created a system for massing fires that would prove superior to anything fielded by potential enemies. The system still depended on indirect fire fundamentals that had not changed since 1902: accurate survey of battery positions, reliable communications between observers and gun positions, mathematical calculation of firing data from observer information. But the battalion FDC had integrated these elements into an organizational structure that could rapidly mass fires from multiple widely dispersed batteries, coordinate timing for time-on-target strikes, shift fires between targets with minimal delay, and maintain continuous fire support to maneuvering infantry units. Equipment improvements accompanied the doctrinal revolution. The French 75mm gun, standard American field artillery in World War I, was replaced by the M2A1 105mm howitzer. The new weapon fired a heavier shell, 33 pounds versus 15 pounds, to a longer range, 12,000 yards versus 9,000 yards. More importantly, the 105 was designed specifically for indirect fire, with a high-angle trajectory that could engage targets in defilade that the flatter-shooting 75 could not reach. Heavier guns completed the artillery family. The M1 155mm howitzer provided divisional general support with a range of nearly 16,000 yards. The M1A1 155mm gun, the Long Tom, could fire to 23,000 yards. The M1 8-inch howitzer reached 19,000 yards. The M1 8-inch gun could engage targets at 35,000 yards, nearly 20 miles. Mobility improvements were equally important. World War I artillery had been horse-drawn, limiting speed of movement and creating massive logistical overhead. American artillery in World War II would be mechanized, towed by trucks and high-speed tractors. This meant batteries could displace rapidly, keeping pace with mechanized infantry and armor. It also meant the United States could deploy artillery battalions to theaters worldwide without requiring enormous numbers of horses and fodder. By September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, American field artillery possessed capabilities that no other army could match. The Battalion Fire Direction Center could mass fires faster and more accurately than any equivalent organization. American forward observers were trained to work with maneuver units, providing continuous fire support during offensive operations. American communications equipment was more reliable than German or Japanese equivalents. American survey procedures were more accurate than Soviet methods. American training emphasized teamwork and standardization rather than individual heroics. The United States was not yet at war, but the artillery community had spent 20 years developing systems that would prove decisive when American forces entered combat. Every element was in place: doctrine, organization, equipment, training, procedures. What remained was to prove the system under fire against enemies who had not expected American artillery to be so devastating. December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Japanese aircraft struck American naval and air bases across Oahu. For the United States, the war had begun. Within weeks, American ground forces were deploying to the Pacific, Europe, North Africa. American artillery units accompanying those forces carried with them the fire direction methods developed at Fort Sill. They would soon demonstrate what centralized fire direction could accomplish. The first major test came in North Africa. On November 8, 1942, American forces landed in Morocco and Algeria as part of Operation Torch. American artillery units, included in the invasion force, faced veteran German and Italian troops who had been fighting in North Africa since 1940. The Germans particularly had developed formidable artillery tactics through 2 years of desert warfare. The initial encounters were not promising for American artillery. At the Kasserine Pass in February 1943, German artillery supporting panzer units proved faster and more accurate than American gunners expected. German forward observers were highly skilled. German counter-battery fire was effective. American artillery units suffered from inexperienced forward observers, inadequate communications equipment that failed in desert conditions, and fire direction officers still learning their trade under combat stress. Major General Ernest Harmon, commanding the 1st Armored Division, filed scathing reports about American artillery performance at Kasserine. Forward observers were poorly trained. Fire missions took too long to execute. Adjustment procedures were hesitant. counter-battery fire was inadequate. The theoretical advantages of the Battalion FDC system had not translated to combat effectiveness because the personnel operating the system lacked experience. Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, commanding Army Ground Forces, responded by sending artillery instructors from Fort Sill to North Africa. These officers conducted intensive training for forward observers, fire direction officers, and battery commanders. They emphasized speed in fire mission execution, aggressive counter-battery fire, close coordination with supported infantry, and bold positioning of forward observers. By May 1943, American artillery in Tunisia had transformed. The 751st Field Artillery Battalion, supporting the 1st Infantry Division at Hill 609, demonstrated the Fire Direction Center operating at peak efficiency. German counterattacks against American positions encountered massed fires from 3 separate artillery battalions coordinated by a single FDC. German soldiers reported that American artillery shells seemed to arrive from every direction simultaneously, creating a wall of steel that no infantry could penetrate. Captain Charles Hunter, forward observer with 2nd Battalion 16th Infantry, documented the evolution. In February at Kasserine, fire missions had taken 15 minutes from initial call to effective fire. By May at Hill 609, the same fire missions were being executed in under 3 minutes. The difference was training, experience, and confidence in the fire direction system. The Sicily campaign in July 1943 showcased American artillery operating in close support of rapidly moving infantry. The terrain in Sicily was mountainous, restricting observation and creating complex firing problems. German and Italian defenders occupied positions on hilltops that dominated approach routes. American infantry attacking up steep slopes needed continuous artillery support to suppress enemy positions on the crests. Forward observers accompanied infantry assault companies, calling for fire on enemy positions as they were identified. Fire direction centers computed firing solutions, accounting for steep angles and elevation differences between guns and targets. Batteries displaced frequently to keep pace with advancing infantry. The system worked because every element, forward observers, FDCs, and gun crews, operated with standardized procedures that enabled rapid coordination even under chaotic combat conditions. Lieutenant Colonel Russell Baker, commanding the 27th Field Artillery Battalion supporting the 45th Infantry Division, described operations near San Stefano in late July 1943. His battalion's 6 batteries were dispersed across several miles of mountainous terrain. Forward observers were with infantry companies attacking German positions on 3 separate hills simultaneously. The battalion FDC was coordinating fire missions for all 6 batteries, shifting fires between multiple targets as infantry needs changed minute by minute. In one 15-minute period, Baker's battalion fired on 9 different targets, some requiring a single battery, others requiring massed fires from multiple batteries. The old system, where each battery operated independently, would have struggled to coordinate even 3 simultaneous fire missions. The centralized FDC handled 9 targets with only minor coordination difficulties, demonstrating the revolutionary increase in responsiveness that battalion-level fire direction provided. The Italian mainland campaign beginning in September 1943 pushed American artillery to new levels of sophistication. The terrain was even more challenging than Sicily. Rivers, mountains, and narrow valleys created restricted avenues of advance. German defenders exploited the terrain masterfully, occupying positions on hilltops and ridges that dominated the valleys below. American infantry attacking through valleys under observed German fire depended absolutely on artillery support to suppress enemy positions. At the Rapido River in January 1944, American artillery fired over 30,000 rounds in 24 hours, supporting the 36th Infantry Division's attack. Multiple artillery battalions fired continuously, coordinated by division artillery headquarters. Counter-battery fire suppressed German artillery. Preparatory fires targeted German defensive positions. Defensive fires protected American troops holding captured positions against German counterattacks. Harassing fires denied German troops rest or freedom of movement in rear areas. The Germans, despite having generally excellent artillery, could not match this sustained, coordinated firepower. German artillery in Italy was largely horse-drawn, limiting mobility. German ammunition supplies were constrained by Allied air interdiction of supply lines. German fire direction remained decentralized to battery level. German artillery could engage targets effectively when properly positioned and supplied, but could not maintain the continuous, responsive fire support that American artillery provided. By spring 1944, as Allied forces prepared for the invasion of France, American artillery doctrine had been validated in 3 theaters. The lessons from North Africa, Sicily, and Italy were being incorporated into training at Fort Sill. New forward observers graduating from artillery school were better prepared than their predecessors had been. Fire direction officers received more extensive training. Communications equipment had been improved based on combat experience. June 6, 1944. Normandy, France. American artillery landed with assault forces on Omaha and Utah beaches. The first American field artillery pieces firing in France were self-propelled 105mm howitzers of the Armored Field Artillery battalions accompanying armored divisions. These mobile guns provided immediate fire support to infantry fighting their way off the beaches and through German defensive positions in the bocage country beyond. Within days, towed artillery battalions were landing and deploying. By June 12, 1944, 6 days after the invasion, American artillery in Normandy included over 500 field artillery pieces from division, corps, and army-level units. These guns were organized into a fire support system that German defenders found overwhelming. The bocage terrain of Normandy, small fields surrounded by earthen embankments topped with thick hedgerows, created ideal defensive positions. German troops could occupy hedgerows with excellent cover and concealment, protected from direct fire, with clear fields of fire across the small fields. American infantry attacking across open fields toward defended hedgerows suffered severe casualties from German machine gun and mortar fire. Artillery provided the solution. Forward observers accompanied every infantry company. When infantry encountered a defended hedgerow, the FO would call for fire on the German position. Within minutes, multiple artillery batteries would saturate the hedgerow with high explosive shells. Once the artillery had suppressed the position, infantry would assault across the open field. The technique was not subtle, but it worked, and it leveraged America's greatest military advantage, the ability to mass overwhelming firepower. German defenders learned to fear American artillery. Captured German soldiers interrogated in June and July 1944 consistently reported that American artillery fire was the most devastating aspect of American military capability. German infantry would occupy defensive positions and successfully repel American infantry attacks, only to be obliterated by American artillery that no amount of field fortification could protect against. The numbers told the story. In July 1944, the First Army in Normandy was firing over 150,000 artillery rounds per day. This was more ammunition in a single day than the entire American Expeditionary Force had fired during some months of World War I. The logistical infrastructure supporting this expenditure was itself a military achievement. Ammunition ships crossing the Atlantic, supply dumps in England, landing craft bringing ammunition ashore, truck convoys delivering shells to battery positions, all operating in coordinated synchronization to keep American guns supplied. The breakthrough from Normandy in late July, Operation Cobra, showcased American artillery at maximum capability. The operation began with a massive air bombardment by heavy bombers, followed immediately by the largest artillery preparation of the European campaign. 7 artillery groups, controlling over 600 guns, fired a coordinated barrage along a 7,000-yard front. The barrage lasted 40 minutes. In those 40 minutes, American artillery fired 12,000 rounds, averaging 1 round every 3 seconds per 1,000 yards of front. German defensive positions under this barrage ceased to exist as organized military units. Bunkers collapsed, communications trenches caved in, barbed wire obstacles were blown apart. German soldiers who survived the barrage were concussed, shell-shocked, unable to coordinate defensive fires when American infantry and armor attacked. The breakthrough that followed was enabled entirely by artillery that had systematically destroyed German defensive capability through mathematical application of high explosive. The pursuit across France in August 1944 tested American artillery's ability to support rapid movement. Armored divisions advancing 50 miles per day needed artillery that could keep pace. Self-propelled artillery proved invaluable. 105mm howitzers on tracked carriages could drive cross-country, keeping up with tank columns. Towed artillery battalions leapfrogged forward. 1. Battery firing while others displaced to new positions ahead, maintaining continuous fire support availability. Forward observers in jeeps accompanied armored reconnaissance units. When American armor encountered German defensive positions, FOs would call for artillery fire from batteries that might be 15 miles behind the front lines. The fire would arrive within minutes. German defenders, expecting time to prepare against armor attacks, found themselves under artillery fire from guns they had not known were in range, directed by observers they could not see, engaging them with accuracy that seemed impossible given the distances involved. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 provided the ultimate test of American artillery under the most difficult conditions. German forces attacked through the Ardennes forest in winter weather that grounded Allied aircraft and made observation difficult. German planners had assumed that weather would neutralize American artillery effectiveness. They were catastrophically wrong. American artillery, even without air observation, could still function using map coordinates provided by ground observers. Radio communications, though degraded by terrain and weather, remained adequate for fire missions. Battery positions, though displaced by German advances, were re-established within hours. The fire direction system, designed to function under any conditions, continued operating. On December 19, 1944, with German forces threatening Bastogne, American artillery of the Third Army reoriented 90 degrees north and began supporting the 101st Airborne Division surrounded in the town. The Third Army's artillery units had been supporting an offensive eastward into Germany. Within 24 hours of receiving orders, they had displaced, reoriented, and were firing missions in support of Bastogne 60 miles to the north. This operational flexibility was possible only because of centralized fire direction and standardized procedures that worked regardless of which units were being supported. During the siege of Bastogne, December 20th to 26th, 1944, American artillery fired continuously despite German attacks, ammunition shortages, and weather that prevented aerial resupply until December 23rd. The artillery fired every shell available, rationing ammunition during critical periods, yet maintaining defensive fires that broke up every German assault on the perimeter. Christmas Day 1944 saw one of the most devastating demonstrations of American artillery coordination. German forces launched a major attack against Bastogne from multiple directions, attempting to overwhelm American defenses before Patton's relief column could arrive. American artillery, coordinated by the Division Artillery FDC inside Bastogne, engaged German formations as they assembled for attack. Forward observers called in fire missions identifying German troop concentrations. The FDC computed firing data and transmitted commands to every available battery. Time on target missions brought shells from multiple batteries simultaneously onto German positions. German soldiers reported that the ground itself seemed to explode, with impacts arriving from every direction at once, giving no warning and no opportunity to take cover. The German attack collapsed under American artillery fire. Entire German battalions that had been preparing to assault became disorganized masses of stunned survivors. German commanders, unable to coordinate their forces under continuous artillery fire, called off the attack. Bastogne held, in large part because American artillery had made it impossible for German forces to mass for effective assault. Prisoners captured during the Battle of the Bulge confirmed what German commanders already knew. American artillery was far superior to German artillery in responsiveness, accuracy, and weight of fire. German artillery batteries operating in the Ardennes struggled with ammunition shortages, poor communications, and decentralized fire direction that made massing fires difficult. American artillery, even under the most difficult conditions of the war, continued operating at near-peak efficiency. March 7, 1945. Remagen, Germany. American forces of the 9th Armored Division captured an intact bridge across the Rhine River. The bridge became the target of desperate German counterattacks, attempting to either recapture or destroy it. American artillery defending the Remagen bridgehead demonstrated the culmination of 4 years of artillery evolution. 15 artillery battalions, including Long Tom batteries firing from positions up to 15 miles from the river, established defensive fires around the bridgehead. Every approach route was registered. Every potential German assembly area was targeted. Fire direction centers coordinated defensive fires that created interlocking zones of fire covering all avenues of approach. German forces attempting to attack the bridgehead moved into a killing zone that artillery had scientifically optimized for maximum destruction. Approach routes were targeted with harassing fires that forced German troops to advance slowly, under cover, taking casualties from shells that arrived without warning. Assembly areas where German forces collected before attacks were targeted with time-on-target missions that caused maximum casualties with minimal warning. German artillery positions attempting to engage the bridge were suppressed by counter-battery fire that was faster and more accurate than anything German forces could achieve. The defense of the Remagen bridgehead showcased American artillery's ability to dominate terrain through indirect fire. German infantry could not assault across open ground without being destroyed by pre-registered artillery fires. German armor could not maneuver without attracting artillery. Fire directed by forward observers with clear observation of all approaches. German artillery could not suppress American forces without being located and destroyed by American counter-battery fire that was superior in every measurable dimension. In 2 weeks of fighting around Remagen, American artillery fired over 250,000 rounds. German forces attacking the bridgehead suffered over 10,000 casualties, the majority caused by artillery fire. The bridge itself was damaged by German artillery and eventually collapsed on March 17th, but by then American engineers had constructed pontoon bridges, and American forces had established a bridgehead 6 miles deep that German forces could not reduce. The final campaigns of the European War in March, April, and May 1945 saw American artillery operating with devastating effectiveness. German forces, depleted by years of attrition, lacking ammunition and mobility, could not withstand American artillery fires that seemed to arrive from nowhere, directed with impossible accuracy, in volumes that exceeded German experience of Soviet artillery on the Eastern Front. German military professionals, interrogated after the surrender, consistently identified American artillery as the most formidable aspect of American military capability. German tactical doctrine emphasized combined arms integration, quality of personnel, and aggressive maneuver. All of these advantages were negated by American artillery that could engage German forces at ranges where German weapons could not respond. Directed by observers German forces could not locate, coordinated through fire direction systems that German artillery had never developed. The superiority of American artillery in World War II was not the result of superior guns. German artillery pieces, particularly the 88mm gun in its various configurations, were technically excellent. The Soviet 122mm howitzer was highly effective. British 25-pounder guns served well throughout the war. American artillery pieces were good, but not dramatically superior to equivalents fielded by other armies. American artillery superiority came from systems integration. The Battalion Fire Direction Center coordinated fires from multiple batteries faster and more accurately than any equivalent organization. Forward observers trained to work with infantry provided responsive fire support that German forward observers, who were often ad hoc appointments rather than trained specialists, could not match. Communications equipment, particularly FM radios, provided reliable voice communications that German and Japanese forces, relying primarily on Morse code radio and telephone lines, could not replicate. Survey procedures ensured that all American artillery batteries were positioned on a common coordinate grid, enabling any observer to call for fire from any battery without complicated corrections. Registration procedures meant that first rounds on unknown targets were far more accurate than German artillery could achieve. Standardized fire mission procedures enabled rapid coordination even between units that had never worked together before. The logistical infrastructure supporting American artillery was itself a decisive advantage. American industry produced ammunition in quantities that German and Japanese industry could not match. American logistics delivered ammunition to forward batteries, even under the most difficult conditions. American trucks and tractors provided mobility that horse-drawn German artillery could not achieve. American maintenance systems kept guns in action even after prolonged firing that would have worn out less maintained equipment. Training was perhaps the most important factor. American artillery officers and enlisted personnel received extensive, standardized training before deploying to combat. Fort Sill graduated thousands of forward observers, fire, direction officers, and survey specialists who arrived in combat theaters with common doctrine, common procedures, and common expectations about how the artillery system functioned. This meant American artillery battalions could be task-organized, supporting different infantry units, and immediately function effectively because everyone spoke the same technical language. German artillery, by contrast, had good equipment and brave soldiers, but lacked the systematic integration that made American artillery so effective. German fire direction remained decentralized to battery level throughout the war. German forward observers were less extensively trained. German communications equipment was less reliable. German survey procedures were more cumbersome. Most critically, German artillery doctrine never emphasized the rapid massing of fires that American doctrine considered routine. Japanese artillery faced even more severe disadvantages. Japanese industrial capacity could not produce ammunition in quantities comparable to American production. Japanese artillery pieces were generally smaller caliber and shorter range than American equivalents. Japanese fire direction was primitive by American standards, with minimal coordination between batteries. Japanese communications equipment was inadequate. Japanese survey methods were rudimentary. Japanese forward observers rarely had radios, relying on telephone lines that were vulnerable to artillery fire. The result was that American artillery could engage targets that Japanese artillery could not reach, mass fires that Japanese artillery could not coordinate, and maintain rates of fire that Japanese logistics could not sustain. Japanese infantry attacking American positions encountered artillery fire of an intensity they had never experienced fighting Chinese forces. Japanese defensive positions were obliterated by artillery preparations that no field fortification could withstand. April 2, 1945. Okinawa, Ryukyu Islands. American artillery supporting the 96th Infantry Division fired over 15,000 rounds in a single day against Japanese positions on Kakazu Ridge. The Japanese defending these positions had constructed fortified caves and bunkers that aerial bombardment and naval gunfire had failed to destroy. American artillery, firing from positions 5 to 8 miles behind the front lines at targets they could not see, systematically destroyed Japanese positions that had seemed impregnable. Forward observers accompanied infantry units attacking up the slopes of Kakazu Ridge. As Japanese positions were identified, FOs called for fire. Fire direction centers computed firing solutions and transmitted commands to batteries. Shells arrived on target within minutes. Japanese machine gun positions were silenced. Japanese mortar positions were destroyed. Japanese command bunkers were collapsed. The infantry assault, supported by continuous artillery fire, succeeded where previous attacks without adequate artillery support had failed. The campaign on Okinawa, April through June 1945, saw American artillery firing over 1 million rounds. This was the highest sustained expenditure of artillery ammunition in the Pacific War. Japanese defenders on Okinawa, dug into prepared positions in mountainous terrain, were defeated as much by American artillery as by infantry assault. Japanese soldiers captured after the battle consistently reported that American artillery fire had been the most psychologically devastating aspect of the campaign. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 ended the Pacific War before American forces invaded the Japanese home islands. Military planners preparing for Operation Olympic, the invasion of Kyushu scheduled for November 1945, had anticipated that artillery would play a decisive role. Artillery units being assembled for Olympic included every type of American artillery piece, from 105mm howitzers to 8-inch guns, with ammunition stockpiles that would have enabled firing rates exceeding even Okinawa levels. The fire direction procedures developed at Fort Sill in the 1930s, refined in combat across 4 years and multiple theaters, would have been applied to the invasion of Japan with overwhelming effect. Japanese defenders, lacking the artillery capabilities that American forces took for granted, would have faced artillery fires that their doctrine, training, and equipment could not counter. The invasion never occurred, but the artillery community knew it had developed capabilities that would have proven decisive. The legacy of World War II American artillery extended far beyond 1945. The Battalion Fire Direction Center became standard in artillery forces worldwide. The concept of massing fires from multiple dispersed batteries through centralized coordination was adopted by armies on every continent. Forward observers working with maneuver units became standard practice. Registration procedures, standardized fire missions, graphical firing tables, all became universal practices. The Korean War, June 1950 to July 1953, validated World War II artillery doctrine against a different enemy in different terrain. American artillery supporting United Nations forces in Korea used the same fire direction procedures developed 20 years earlier at Fort Sill. The results were identical: rapid, accurate, overwhelming firepower that enemy forces could not match. Chinese and North Korean forces attacking American positions in Korea encountered artillery fire that seemed impossible. American batteries, positioned miles behind the front lines, could mass fires within minutes on targets identified by forward observers. Time on target missions brought shells from multiple directions simultaneously. Counter-battery fire suppressed enemy artillery. Defensive fires broke up massed infantry assaults that had succeeded against South Korean forces lacking American artillery support. The Battle of Cheopyeong-ni in February 1951 saw American artillery repeat the defensive success of Bastogne. Surrounded American and French forces held against Chinese human wave attacks through artillery fire that created a barrier of steel around the perimeter. Chinese forces attacking in mass formations were slaughtered by American artillery that had registered every approach route and could deliver fires within seconds of observers reporting targets. The Vietnam War saw further refinement of artillery procedures with digital fire direction computers, helicopter-mounted forward observers, and improved munitions. But the fundamental concepts remained unchanged from 1945. Centralized fire direction, massing of fires, forward observers with maneuver units, coordinated fire support integrated with maneuver operations. Modern artillery, with GPS-guided munitions, computerized fire direction, and satellite communications, is vastly more capable than World War II artillery. A single modern 155mm howitzer firing GPS-guided Excalibur rounds can achieve what required a battalion of guns in 1945. But the organizational principles, the integration of observers with maneuver units, the centralized coordination of fires, all trace directly to developments at Fort Sill between 1929 and 1941. The transformation from direct fire to indirect fire fundamentally changed warfare. Artillery became a standoff weapon system capable of engaging enemies at ranges measured in miles rather than hundreds of yards. Forward observers became the eyes of the artillery, identifying targets and directing fires from positions where gun crews would never venture. Fire direction centers became the brains of the artillery, coordinating fires from multiple batteries with mathematical precision. Gun crews became specialized technicians, executing fire missions computed by others against targets they would never see. The human cost of this transformation was paid primarily by those on the receiving end. German infantry attacking American positions, Japanese soldiers defending Pacific Islands, Chinese forces assaulting in Korea, all discovered that courage and determination were insufficient against artillery that could strike from beyond visual range with accuracy and volume that no field fortification could protect against. American artillerymen who developed and employed these systems rarely thought of their work in terms of innovation or revolution. They were solving practical problems using available tools and mathematical principles. Forward observers called in coordinates. Fire direction centers computed firing data. Gun crews loaded and fired. The system worked because every element functioned according to standardized procedures that had been developed through training, refined through experience, and validated through results. But the artillery officers who testified before the Westervelt Board in 1919, the instructors who developed the Fire Direction Center at Fort Sill in the 1930s, the forward observers who called in fire missions from Normandy to Okinawa, the fire direction officers who computed firing solutions under combat stress, the gun crews who loaded and fired through days and nights of continuous operations, all contributed to a revolution in military affairs as significant as the introduction of gunpowder itself. They created a system where artillery could fire without seeing the target, where shells could arrive simultaneously from batteries miles apart, where fires could be shifted between targets in seconds, where a forward observer with a radio could call down destruction from guns 15 miles away. This was the promise of indirect fire fully realized. Artillery as a precision instrument of destruction, mathematically applied, systematically coordinated, devastating in effect. The mathematics were elegant, the procedures were standardized, the results were measured in enemy casualties, terrain controlled, missions accomplished. Artillery had become an invisible hand reaching across the battlefield to crush enemies who never saw the guns that killed them. The crews who fired those guns would never see the results of their fire, except as reports from forward observers, numbers on firing tables, rounds expended, missions complete. Lieutenant Waldron, watching smoke rise from coordinates 12 miles distant, understood what he was witnessing. This was modern warfare in its purest form. Abstract, mathematical, deadly. The enemy position that had threatened American troops was gone, eliminated by shells fired from guns the enemy never saw, directed by calculations the enemy never understood, arriving with precision the enemy never expected. This was what 25 years of development had achieved: artillery that could kill at 15 miles, forward observers who could identify targets and call in fire faster than enemies could react, fire direction centers that could coordinate fires from dozens of batteries as easily as orchestrating a single gun, logistics that could sustain firing rates impossible for enemy forces to match, training that prepared every element of the system to function under any conditions. The German position at grid 627 to 419 was only one target among thousands engaged that day across the Western Front. Every American infantry company had forward observers. Every observer had radio contact with fire direction centers. Every FDC could mass fires from multiple battalions. Every battery had sufficient ammunition. Every gun crew was trained to sustain maximum rates of fire. The cumulative effect was that American forces advancing across Germany in March 1945 moved under an umbrella of artillery support that enemies could not penetrate, defended by fires that enemies could not suppress, supported by a system that enemies could not match. German forces facing this onslaught fought bravely and skillfully, but bravery and skill were insufficient against systematic application of overwhelming firepower. The story of artillery's transformation from direct fire to indirect fire is ultimately a story about systems, integration, and the application of mathematics to warfare. It is not a story of individual heroism, though individual artillerymen certainly displayed heroism. It is not a story of technological breakthrough, though technology played important supporting roles. It is a story of how methodical development of procedures, standardization of training, and integration of capabilities created a military system that proved decisively superior to all contemporary alternatives. The gunners who fired the Long Tom at grid 627 to 419 on March 14, 1945, probably never learned whether their shell hit the target. They fired when commanded, loaded the next round when ordered, continued firing until the mission ended. They were one small element in a vast system that had evolved over decades, proven in combat across continents, refined through experience paid for in blood. But they were part of something larger than themselves, something that had fundamentally changed how wars were fought. They were part of the artillery system that American ingenuity had created, American industry had equipped, American training had perfected, and American forces had employed to decisive effect. They had helped prove that in modern warfare, the guns that fired without seeing their targets, directed by observers who called in coordinates, coordinated by specialists who computed mathematics, were more effective than any amount of visible firepower aimed by eye. The age of direct fire had ended decades earlier, terminated by rifles that could kill gunners at 1,000 yards. The age of indirect fire had arrived, bringing with it capabilities that previous generations of artillery officers would have considered impossible. American artillery in World War II represented the full maturation of indirect fire doctrine, organization, equipment, and training. German soldiers crouched in bunkers 12 miles from American gun positions learned this truth in the instant before high-explosive shells ended their war. They never saw the guns that killed them. They never understood the system that had targeted them. They simply ceased to exist, eliminated by mathematics applied through steel, fired from positions beyond their vision, directed by observers beyond their reach. This was what indirect fire meant in practice. This was what American artillery had become. This was why artillery crews started firing without seeing their targets and hit Germans 15 miles away. The system worked. The mathematics were correct. The results were measured in enemy positions destroyed, missions accomplished, wars won. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.